Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. As I was flying down this morning, I had this picture in my head of kind of a parody of the commercials. Well, you've just come through Frankenstorm and Hurricane Sandy, and what are you going to do? And I'm going to Disney. So here I am, and I'm delighted to be here. And what I'd like to do is take you around the world. I'm going to really make 4 key points for you this morning. Number 1 is that the world that we knew after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the post-Cold War era, where we had one superpower, the US, and kind of everybody else, has now morphed into an integrated global environment. The second point is that as this world has become more integrated, so has the financial industry. I know you've been through many, many sessions about implications in terms of regulation. I'm not going to go through that to any great degree, but there are significant challenges for regulation and for enforcement. You know, what are the boundaries? And those of you who are visiting from other countries, home country supervision, what are the boundaries? How do you integrate with your counterparts? Thirdly, I really want to focus on the next period ahead. We face a very critical period, certainly here in the US in the next months, but internationally in 2013, and it doesn't look like it's going to be a pretty year. And finally, and I wrote this, of course, before Miss Sandy showed up, prepare for storms, yes, and opportunities. But let me just start, and I'd like to ask if anybody knows who this gentleman is, Psy. Show of hands. Anybody know who he is? All right, we got 1 or 2. Psy is a South Korean pop artist. He is now the hit of YouTube. And he has a song, here's his video, Gangnam Style, and he has attracted, I don't know if you can see the number in the far right, 531+ million people have seen that video. 500 million young people have seen that video since July 15th. Just to give you a picture. So here we get to see that. Now, why am I pointing that out to you? First of all, you get brownie points now with your kids and grandkids that you can actually say you know who Psy is. But I just think it's an interesting thought to begin our discussion by saying that probably at this point, the 2nd or 3rd most popular video of all time is not Michael Jackson, not Lady Gaga, not whatever group you want to infer, but rather a South Korean pop singer who doesn't speak in English. And with that, I will say welcome to our new world. I want to start by just taking a look back for us to look at 2002. And this is actually a great, I'm going to note citations for people if you want to look up information on your own. This is actually from CNN's Money website, and it's an interactive piece, but I just captured a couple screens. These are the 10 largest economies in the world 10 years ago. And I want to draw your attention, right, to who's there. Of course, we've got the US, and then I want to note here we've got North America, Canada, and Mexico after NAFTA, and we've got China here. 2 emerging market countries out of the 10, the larger, but basically we have North America, Western Europe, and China. Let's fast forward now 10 years to now. This is, again, these are estimates just to put out there, but at the same time, what do we see? China went from number 6 to number 2 in the past 10 years. So that's pretty significant. Just again back so you can see 6 to 2. Secondly, we have what are called the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. All 4 are now in the top 10 economies. 3 of them were not there 10 years ago, and the 4th was number 6. That's a big change. So all 4 of those economies, 4 out of 10, are now outside of the traditional area of America and Western Europe. Let's extrapolate forward. These numbers aren't necessarily anything to count on. They're just looking at current trends going forward, and there's a lot of question whether or not we're going to see it quite this way. But look at what happens. You have still the US at number 1, China, and the US very much kind of almost in a league of their own. Western Europe, but again now, 3 of the 4 BRICS are in the top 6. 3 of the top 6 economies in the world are then emerging market countries within 5 years. And there are analyses that actually say that depending on US growth and Chinese growth, that differential could narrow substantially. Now let's take a look at trade. I just sort of picked out two iconic products for us, right? So first of all, the iPhone. The iPhone, it says in the back, made in China. In fact, there are parts from more than 5 countries that go into the assembly of the iPhone. Parts are brought into China from more than 5 countries. They're assembled in China, shipped back here. Design, product comes from the US, profits go to the US. Very hard then to interpret the trade statistics, but here's one product, and you've really got 6, 7 countries that are contributing to that product. On the right-hand side, I've taken the Cars.com's American-Made Index for this year, and that looks at the cars that have the largest component of U.S. parts. Has to be a minimum of 75% to make the index. The top 3 probably have roughly around 85%, and of course it's rather ironic, wouldn't one think, that the Toyota Camry and the Honda Accord, 2 Japanese vehicle makers, account for 2 of the 3 spots on the American-Made Index. Money has also become more global. This is a chart or a pie chart looking at which countries buy U.S. Treasury securities. It's important because that number has gone up from roughly 19% of the total to over 1/3. It's actually about 34.5. And that is key because now, since more than 1/3 of the people who buy U.S. government debt are outside of the U.S., we need to be thinking about their perspectives on the U.S. as a risk and as an investment. And finally, I want to just insert this. This is from a piece that was an op-ed piece by a gentleman by the name of David Smick. He's a well-known consultant in international finance. He wrote in the Washington Post recently. And one thing that he said was really really struck me, and I've put together a chart of the Dow here, or grabbed it from the St. Louis Fed. And what he says here is to match the success of the rise in the Dow from roughly 800 in the late 70s to the highs that we've really seen today, the Dow Jones would have to rise to 175,000. That really gives us an idea of what we've seen in the last 30 years and makes us really ask ourselves, are we really going to see that? Let's take a look at regulatory areas. Financial regulation has often evolved as a response, either to events or to innovation. We can look at the Great Depression, certainly, as a source of the Glass-Steagall Act and a slew of regulations from the 30s. But if you notice, there's been quite a bit in the last 10 years. It has really impacted the profession, and it's really been a slew of legislation, a slew of regulation, and we're really grappling with it. I'll just pause for a moment to talk about the Basel Committee, which is really one of the, I would say, hallmark groups of international financial sector regulation. And it itself sits within the Bank for International Settlements, and that's the central bank for central banks of the major industrial countries, but it has now expanded in recent years to include key countries around the world. I'm going to just draw your attention to Basel III, which will start to be implemented really in the next year, going out several years. It adds on a liquidity minimum to banks, where banks are going to need to hold capital basically for liquidity to run themselves for 30 days. And that is going to be important because there's a cost associated with it. This is an IMF staff note which tries to quantify it both in terms of the impact in the cost of credit. The point to you is that implementing this new capital accord is going to have an impact on banks and going to have an impact on cost of capital. Finally, in terms of regulation, and I think really this is across the board, the question is, what is the level of effective regulation? How much is an appropriate response? How much is really stifling activity? We need to come up with a better balance. Clearly, there have been excesses that we need to address, but at the same time, we also need to understand that we can't drown industries in regulation where it's very difficult for them to function. I think hand in hand with that goes enforcement, and I think the poster from the Occupy Wall Street protester, I think, says it very nicely, that we have lost the public's trust in the financial sector, and we need to do some work to regain it. Let me now move over into talking about the year ahead. First, let's just take a look at This is the IMF, International Monetary Fund's latest global forecast. And I'm not sure how much you can really read that, but I think the key things for you to see is that global output, and pretty much also through the regions, is going to slow in 2013 from where it was in 2010 and 2011. We moved a little bit higher this year, and next year we're going to stall. And so this is really not a pleasant outlook, and this is our base outlook. And the IMF was very, very clear that they are very concerned that the risks are to the downside. I think some of the things that I want you to focus on are that the challenges facing us at this point are not private sector challenges. It's not about excessive consumer borrowing and consumer balance sheets that we had in 2007. It's not about banks overstretching. It's not about the private sector really very much at all. It is about fiscal policy, about budgets that are out of control in countries around the world, and a huge debt overhang. And one of the keys to that debt overhang relates to the aging of the baby boomer population, and we see it in Japan, and we see it across Europe, and we see it here. It's also a question of the extent of the safety net that we've put into place. Can we afford it at the same level going forward when we're going to see a dip in our taxpayer base to support this? What's going to be appropriate going forward? And we really don't know. And the problem is, for all of us, is that the unknown is something that is completely out of all of our control. Where do things stand today? There are really several threats that I'm going to focus in on a little bit more. Of course, there's Europe's crisis and downturn. We've heard all about this, an ongoing recession in Europe and their financial crisis, sovereign crisis, our U.S. fiscal cliff, which I'm sure you have heard quite a bit of and we'll all be hearing more of immediately after the election. Another potential problem in Congress with raising the debt ceiling as we hit early 2013. Generally slower growth in emerging regions. And then finally, a lot of wild cards, like Miss Sandy that we saw this week. Let's just stop for a moment. We'll talk about Europe. Europe really is three issues rolled into one. Number one, we have the sovereign crisis where there are a number of countries that borrowed well in excess of really what they were capable of servicing. So you certainly saw it before in Greece. In Ireland, there was a different problem where the banks got into trouble and the government bailed them out and took on all their debts, and then that was now the government's problem. Spain, there is a real huge real estate bust that has happened that has impacted the banks that lent, and now as the government is then having to deal with those issues, it's actually creating a battle between the regions and central government. Who needs to foot the bill for somebody else's mistake? Second issue, banking system. I looked before at Basel III, and then even within Europe, European banks need to raise more money to have capital to be at a safe level of functioning. And that capital raising is in the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. They're going to have to, whether they do it in the markets, whether they do it through debt, however they're going to be doing it, what it means is that they're going to be lending less. And that's going to be key for us because a lot of international banks function here in the US and lend to our corporates, and they're very active in some key industries. Many of them will be pulling back. I'm just going to touch briefly China and India. I think, again, two of the big, exciting, growing economies, both of which are facing some headwinds. China, we've seen Chinese growth slow, if you will, to 7.5% this year. It's its lowest level in many years. And we also have a changeover in the premier of China to the new Premier Xi. Now, what's happening in China is both the slowdown is certainly welcome because growth was really getting so fast and there was higher inflation, so it's good that now it's calmed down a bit. That's a positive thing from the perspective of the markets. However, China itself is undergoing change. You have a growing middle class. You have a growing young population, which doesn't take as well to this sort of enforced unity, enforced stability. There's a lot of corruption. The party is distrusted. And so there are a lot of questions. Social media is very much controlled, and yet there are enough holes that it's very clear that the government doesn't have quite the control that it used to. It isn't necessarily at all a negative thing if growth in the next 10 years doesn't quite come up to the levels that it has in the past 10 years. And so that isn't necessarily negative, but the question is really going to be for the party and for the government, how are they going to handle this transition of a growing middle class and a big young population that wants more openness? And now we come home. We're going to have to deal with debt, ladies and gentlemen. The right line graph relates to the current debt ceiling, and it's currently at 16.394 trillion. At current count, we are expected to hit that debt ceiling in the early part of next year. On the left side, you can see how much the debt ceiling has been raised. And I don't know if you can read the small print, but basically it's been raised lots of times under Democrats and lots of times under Republicans. From my perspective here as an economist for you, it's not about who's to blame, who's right, who's wrong. We've got a problem that we've got to resolve. And we're all going to have to take part in this. Whatever it is, what we're definitely going to see are spending cuts and higher taxes. From my perspective, it doesn't matter who takes office, the hole is simply too big, the problem is simply too large, and we're going to have to all get together and contribute to the solution. No one's going to like it, but that's what we're going to have to do. And the faster we do it, the better off we are. Now, we can listen to the candidates and hear what they talk about, and really some of the cuts that they talk, frankly, have been at the margins. Because if you look at the pie chart on the left, really the spending that happens in the government is in 4 key areas: Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, defense, and the combination of safety net programs and tax credits. That's where the money is. People may want to shy away from that, but the fact of the matter is we're not going to get anywhere until we cut where we spend. And on the other side, you can see where the money comes from. The money comes, about half of it, from individual taxes, a little over a third at this point from payroll taxes, and then you can see excise and corporate taxes being much smaller. So this constellation is going to have to change because we can't afford our current level of spending, and we also are not going to be able to sustain the level of debt growth that we've had in recent years. One of the other, I guess, final things that I'll just talk about for a second are all of the wild cards. We have, obviously, geopolitical risks, and they're quite serious. Right now, they're a little calmer this week, but they certainly could flare up all around the Middle East. We don't need to go through the whole list. China and Japan could go to war over a set of remote islands. We have all kinds of areas that can flare up. That can both have impact to us, obviously, with respect to Iran being perhaps the most serious in terms of the impact on the U.S., but also in terms of the impact on energy prices. If we are growing at a very, very modest rate of growth, 2% or even below, then if you have a shock can send us over the edge. The second issue that I talk about are environmental risks. Obviously, we've seen this week with Miss Sandy the havoc that can be wreaked. I'm not here, again, to have a discussion over good, bad, right, or wrong. The fact of the matter is that we're having more and more disruptions, and they're more costly, and they're having an impact on a greater number of lives and livelihoods, not simply in this country, but around the world. And so rather than have any arguments about what the cause is, what the issues are, my point here today is that we need to start to build them into our models and in our thinkings. Dealing with individuals, dealing with businesses, dealing with government and other entities, we need to be thinking about business risk and business disruptions, not simply as something unusual, something exogenous that might happen once in a while, but something that's happening regularly. And then finally, just to sort of say, with all the issues that we have a lot of very exciting things to look forward to in the U.S., indeed, if we can tackle them. So if we're able to really get a handle on some of the debt and fiscal problems that we actually have a not bad picture. We have a housing revival that is in the early stages. We have tremendous opportunities in the energy industry. We're looking at manufacturing jobs coming back. We remain a center for innovation and technology. And as we've seen this week, we can also have some interesting ways to use government stimulus to actually upgrade our infrastructure, which is sorely needed. And then just a few notes that I had for your world. Certainly with whatever you're doing, I think the challenge for all of us is to embrace new media and tools to help you grow your markets and stay in touch with each other, certainly. And NASBA's forum here is certainly a good start. And I'd also sort of say zero in on opportunities. Do some window shopping on things that might be interesting for you when opportunities could come up in tough times. And with that, I thank you very much and look forward to hearing more from you later.